context, of course, is, so we've seen, right, all the different kinds of ethical issues that arise in the design and management of technologies. Then after that, in the last module, we essentially went deeper, right, that what kind of ethics should we really be looking to embrace? And that's where we looked at so many of these different theories of building aspiration, building cultural capacity to aspire, develop a critical thinking, and right, essentially being involved ourselves as political agents in the overall objectives that we want our technologies to achieve. Yeah, so it means consciously thinking about siding with the power weak, thinking about emancipation of the power weak, where Marx, we reviewed a little bit of Marx and how he viewed that all of this is really shaped by relationships of production. And therefore, we ourselves also need to think of ourselves as workers, as laborers in this process, and that we ourselves will feel much better once the method through which we build technologies, as well as the output that our technologies achieve, right? That eventually leads to positive social relationships, it leads to more equality. So that's where Marx came in, and then we also looked at Paulo Freire, who further talked about how we really need to be embedded with the communities that we are working towards empowering, right, and to overcoming any entrenched power inequalities that persist. Yeah. So with design, then we started getting deeper into what kind of design methods are there that allow us this particular method or this particular view of building technology, that we can be embedded with the communities, we can realize what they want to do, and we can support them in achieving their objectives. Yeah. So here, this is often how you would think about the job of design, that there are a lot of theories that can inform, there's a lot of technologies that are available for use, and you can learn from the field about then how to apply these technologies. So given all of this knowledge, it's sort of like a one-way interaction that you then build the technology. Yeah. But what we started seeing last time is that this is a very restricted view, because the space of design itself is very vast. Yeah. So this particular framework is quite useful, which basically says that the view in the previous diagram, you can think of it as functionalism, right? That there is some objective knowledge, objective truths that you can achieve, and it will also bring a lot of order in the world. There will be, right? So if you follow this knowledge, it means that eventually you'll figure out, right, what's the right thing to be done. But this view is only one among many views of design, right? So when we think about even emancipation of the weak, right, then one view is that, well, reality is not objective. There is a lot of subjectivism, there is a lot of plurality. And this is where Habermas's theories of the public sphere come into relevance. That now you remember very early on we discussed about Habermas and how he says that federated public spheres should be built for deliberation and discussion, right? And these once small networks, they will contribute towards new insights about problems that different groups are facing, and these will eventually bubble up, right? So so that's why it's called a federated network. So the word federation is used pretty much like how it's used in India, for example, where you have a center and then you have federal autonomy that's given to a lot of states, right? So in the same way, what Habermas basically says is there's a lot of pluralism that you need to keep in mind so that you can learn and you can build some kind of an order, right? Marx falls in somewhere over here, radical structuralism, where Marx is basically saying that, well, there's a lot of conflict, right? So Marx is essentially embracing conflict as an underlying principle, right? So the labor and capital conflict around which all of his arguments are structured. But at the same time, he's also saying that there is an objective way of life, an objective social organization that we can move towards, right? Which is basically his vision of communism, how the commons are integrated as part of this. Yeah. Then yet another view is neo-humanism, which says that, yeah, there is conflict, so you need to embrace that. And there is also a lot of pluralism, right? So it's not that you might get to one truth or one way of being in the world. Yeah. And this is essentially also a lot of many different thoughts come in over here, right? In fact, an ideal democracy is also what you would club over here. That an ideal democracy will create spaces where you can discuss conflicts, right? What we call agonistic spaces, which are spaces for discussion, debate, and to embrace that, yeah, there are disagreements, right? So an ideal democracy can also be viewed as something over here. Habermas's view of democracy is something which can bring eventual order, right? This view of democracy is something which is essentially embracing that there will always be conflict, right? So we've also talked about it in the context of wicked problems that you may not exactly be able to find a solution, right? Other philosophies which also fall in over here would be even something like postmodernism, where you're actually embracing that there is no one truth, one knowledge, and you need to embrace multiple views, multiple and find ways to cohabit with different views coming in. Yeah. So now, very similar to this is another framework that helps you think about that when you're doing design. On one axis, you're actually seeing users as participants in the design process. On the other axis, you're seeing experts coming in with their views and figuring out how their views can be embedded over here. Another axis is whether it is design led or research led. Research led meaning that you do research beforehand and you try and then find out what's the right way to proceed. And design led means that through the design process itself, you're uncovering many of these aspects. Yeah. So basically, using these two frameworks, you can actually start clubbing many different design methods. Now, conferences like CHI, conferences like CSCW, they talk a lot about many different types of design methods. So you can actually start clubbing these design methods on and mapping them to these kinds of frameworks, because this can then help you figure out that what's the right or what seems to be an appropriate design method to pursue given, right, whatever views you would want to follow, right? Whether you want to be more subjective and pluralist, or whether you believe in a more Marxist philosophy that okay, there is some objective theory of communism and so on, which is ultimately what we want to move towards, right? And within this framework, you can then say that I want to move towards emancipation of the weak, towards right, more equality. So ultimately, all these design methods are also moving towards the same goal, but they're located at different places in this quadrant, right? So they're all located at different places in this matrix, and being able to situate them is therefore useful to broadly understand, right, what is the view of the world that they're embracing. Yeah. So we briefly started discussing some of these methods like a capability approach to design. Right? Capability approach comes now. Remember, very early on we talked about Amartya Sen's theory, or what's called the capability theory, right? That you want to people need a certain set of capabilities through which they can then realize what Amartya Sen calls functionings, right? Different functionings which are achieved once you have these capabilities. Yeah. Now, this particular design method, for example, it doesn't talk so much about conflict at all. Yeah. So it doesn't talk so much about why or what conflicts can arise if people have different capabilities and so on. It is taking a more ordered view that once people do have a basic set of capabilities, then they can do different things with it. So it's sort of free ranging on the x-axis, that some capabilities will predictably lead to certain outcomes, versus in many cases these capabilities may not lead to one output or outcome, but there can be different realizations of this. But fundamentally, it doesn't look so much at the conflict dimension. It's more ordered, right? So one place where conflict can arise, for example, is right, what are these basic set of capabilities? And in fact, Amartya Sen himself he in fact says that I don't want to define it. I don't want to define that, okay, X, Y, Z are some basic capabilities that people should have, right? Like good health or good education and so on. He says that that's something that people should discover democratically on their own, right? But fundamentally, you can see that this particular approach doesn't talk so much about conflict. Very similarly, we've talked about aspirational approaches. And here we largely looked at Appadurai's what he calls building cultural capacity to aspire. But where he specifically says that you want to overcome oppressive, you want power structures. You want to build capacity of people to overcome oppressive power structures, right? Which is very much in the conflict domain. Yeah. And Appadurai again, however, is free ranging on the x-axis. That it doesn't say anything that, well, this oppressive power structure should move towards, let's say, communism, or should move towards like what's called the pluriverse or more postmodernist kind of approaches. Yeah. Right. Right. However, if you look at Kentaro Toyama, who talks about more from an individual perspective, that you can act as mentors, right? So build technologies which enable mentors and others to come together, and the mentors can then nurture aspirations and also nurture the capacity for people to deliver on these aspirations. Yeah, so that's great. And Toyama argues why an aspirational based approach is better than a needs based approach. But again, it doesn't talk so much from a conflict point of view. And it also suffers from other issues, that what are these aspirations? Because very often the aspirations could be influenced by Western notions of what is supposed to be good or what is considered as development. Yeah. And which may not really, right? Like ownership of cars or like various things, right? Conveniences, technologies of convenience that you can think about. And you would want to aspire for those as opposed to aspiring for greater equality or rights or something of that sort. Yeah. Now, similarly, there's dozens of other methods. Yeah. One method which looks at it from a post-colonial lens. This essentially does embrace conflict to an extent that it says that whatever reactions you might see from people or expect from people, that's also a result of history. Right. And in this history, colonialism has played a big role in shaping the cultures and histories of at least communities in the global south. So you should understand it from that lens. Other method talks about how designing for others can become imperialistic, which means that you're bringing in your notions of, and in fact, this is not just Western notions, right? So the West also exists in developing in the global South as well, right? For example, even in India, there's so much of inequality. Yeah, many of us who are well off and doing economically much better we have, right? So there's very little to distinguish ourselves from, let's say, people in developed countries. Yeah. And even in developed countries, there are pockets of underdevelopment, right? So homeless, for example, in the US, or jobless and homeless people in these countries, right? So essentially, notion of global north and global south is sort of blurred in the sense that countries in the global south have internally some of these demarcations as well, right? So there's a global north and the global south even within global south countries, and similarly even within global north countries. Yeah. And this essentially increases the risk that when people who are designing, we don't understand the context of the communities that we're working very well, then we can possibly bring in our own notions. And this ends up being imperialistic because we might understand certain technologies, we might be more prone towards using certain technologies, maybe we've built them, and we might end up forcing these on other people. Yeah. So this design method essentially says that, well, you need to be cognizant, right? And therefore, it again brings in an element of conflict of, right, that some of these technologies can introduce these rifts, and that's something that we therefore need to be conscious about. Yeah. Then now, how do we understand communities in a better way? So this paper talks about apathy, sympathy, and empathy as key drivers that designers should think about. And basically, they say that empathy is the right one to pursue, because you're not then acting in a patronizing way, let's say, where you might want to be sympathetic, and apathy in general, right, where you don't want to really bother about understanding the context. You're just there to work on whatever you think is the right thing to do. So these are again underlying principles that you can follow so that it becomes more empathetic. Then at another layer, right? So it's also very important that when we're thinking of these design methods, right, we also are able to mentally club them together. That you might want to do capability approaches or aspiration approaches or look at it from a post-colonial lens and so on. And you might want to take an empathetic stance, right? In any of these methods, you can take you would need an empathetic stance to follow any of these methods. Yeah. And then what other tricks could you follow, right? So asset-based design, now this is that for any of these methods that we've talked about, you can actually also try to recognize certain assets in the community. These could be more skilled people in the community. These could be trying to understand what norms exist and which are in line with freedom, emancipation, empowerment. So for example, in communities, right, you have social norms of early marriage or domestic violence, but those may not agree with the kind of stance that of empowerment that we want to work with. So you don't want to embrace those institutional structures. Rather, you want to embrace and work with strengthening some other institutional structures that are more empowering and bring more power-based equality in the community. Yeah. So to work with, right, so the reason why I'm talking about layers is that you can follow aspirational methods or capability and similarly look at it from post-colonial and anti-imperialistic stances. But for any of these, you need a common underlying layer of empathy. You can also use certain tricks like recognizing what are assets and then designing which will help you design faster or in a better way by working with these assets that you've identified. Right. Similarly, another notion is that of communitization, that you identify people in the community who are more tech savvy, right? So they'll be able to act as bridges also between, because they understand the needs of the community and what people want, as well as they understand the technology. So they'll be ideal people who can help translate many of these mechanisms into practice. Yeah. Then trust is another factor, and ways in which you can build trust, ways in which you can gain more credibility in the eyes of the community, because then they will participate in a more complete manner, in a more engaged and involved manner. Yeah. So the point with this discussion essentially is that there are a wide variety of design methods that you'll encounter if you start looking into that kind of literature. Yeah. But it's important to be able to, and all of these design methods will be geared towards emancipation and so on. Right? But it's important to understand what overarching framework are they really embracing. Yeah. And some of these frameworks we know might be more appropriate as in different communities. Yeah. Now, one of the very method that we've also been continuously referring to throughout, and which is considered to be very ideal and leading towards more equality, right? Because it fundamentally embraces that view, right? So this method is participatory design, and it originated in the Scandinavian country, and over there also a lot in the context of when technologies were being introduced in the workplace. Right. So here also, ever since the beginning, we've been referring to automation, right? That when automation technologies were introduced in the industry, this led to many changes, right? So people started seeing how some of this automation could lead to de-skilling, where the skills that people had was now being encoded into machines. So that much, so you didn't need skilled people as much. And it also created a skills polarization, that you needed unskilled labor on the one hand that could just run these machines, and more skilled, let's say, programmers or machine designers who were essentially taking now power away from skilled machinists. Right? So in the same way, now this automation, right, we discussed it in the context of lathe machines, gear cutting machines, right? But this is, of course, throughout the industry. And in the Scandinavian countries, it was the newspaper industry that was being disrupted with automation, right? So when copywriting, typesetting, these kind of processes which were done manually, now you could do it on a computer, right? And that meant that the workers who were employed could now be displaced. And so how would you deal with that, right? So how would you design these or embed these automation technologies in a different way so that all the skill that these people had gained, that could still translate into and they could still continue to be employed in this setup. So this participatory design method, therefore, right from the beginning, it was born out of the idea that you had to involve the users. You could not just impose some technology or some automation, but you had to involve them, and you had to see how the technology is actually empowering them rather than displacing them or disempowering them. So therefore, right, so it talks about co-determination, right? That together with the workers, together with the users, you determine what the technologies should be doing. What objective should I be following with the technology? Should it be automation or should it be something else, let's say quality improvement, right? Because this will really help us understand, and right, what kind of power equations also exist between workers and managers. Because right, one kind of stakeholder could be pushing certain technologies with a different objective, right? Managers would want to push technologies that can impose more control or take more control over workers, right? Give more power in their hands, versus workers would want something else, right? So co-determination is where you're involving all stakeholders in that process, right? Democracy, of course, becomes fundamental over here, because you can only do this once you discuss, once you debate with everybody. Yeah. So it strives for agreement and consensus. And reflexivity means that you're able to understand from the other person's viewpoint and change your own viewpoints accordingly, right? So once you're more aware of views of people, of other stakeholders, it might bring some change in your own views as well, right? So this also we've discussed as a key element of democracy, that it helps in learning. It helps you change your own views, right? So participatory design has embraced that principle from the get-go, and that's why we've been referring to it again and again, because it naturally molds itself to all the concepts that right, we've been discussing, of figuring out what is it that communities want, and to be ethical so that you're not harming other people, from right, understanding views of all stakeholders, universalizing the effects of some of these technologies, right? So these are the various ethical principles, and this is really participatory design is really a very interesting and ideal manifestation of all of this. Yeah. So from a more concrete way of how participatory design is actually done, right? So normally people, right, think of it in terms of three stages. That first, designers and users, they start interacting with each other so that they understand one another, and then they together design, right? They clarify what are the goals, what are the objectives, and then they together think about what is the way to design the technology, and then they prototype. Yeah. So then they prototype, and overall, right, in terms of whether these methods are doing a good job or not, you want to see whether they're improving overall the quality of life, they're able to deliver on the objectives that had been decided, right? It's all a collaborative and cooperative environment over here. Yeah. So those are some key methods through which participatory design is practiced. Yeah. And note also, right? So this, right, one of the first papers around on this, right, came way back in the 2004, and the thought processes have been around for even much before that. Yeah. However, now if you look at how design is actually being done, right, you will find many companies, many people claiming that they follow participatory design methods, but actually that's not true. Yeah, because the meaning of participatory design has been corrupted. It's used in a participation is considered right, in a very narrow sense. So, for example, some places where things are being done in the name of participatory design, but it's not embracing this actual vision, the original vision of participatory design. So, for example, participation design emphasizes on learning and empowerment, right? Learning where you learn about views of other people and you're working with them, right? But very often you see that where these methods are implied, it's done more with a feel good feeling, to create a feel good atmosphere. But actually, there is not so much of learning and empowerment that is happening. Companies are ultimately doing what they want to do, right? So this participation partly becomes tokenistic, and partly it becomes only relevant from the company's point of view to understand what works for the users, right? So if you understand, users are liking to network with one another and to communicate with one another, then you'll build a social networking platform to do just that, right? But that's not something which is going to create empowerment, right? Empowerment or learning will be created if your social networking platform has more opportunity for discussion and debate, right? And in a civil way, right? And that's what had participatory design been followed as as really a key principle, it wouldn't have led to the current kind of a design of social networking applications. Yeah, right. So the internet, for example, web companies, right? They don't do any of this, right? They don't sit across with the users and debate and discuss, right? What is it that users really want, and where are we failing? There's none of that discussion which happens. Whatever in whatever way they say they're user centered or they involve the users in the design process is more for their benefit, so that they understand what is the capability of the user to use a technology. So how to design that feature, yeah, how to do continuous A/B testing in terms of what features draw more engagement than other features. So they in principle, right, they say that they're involving the users, but actually it's not done so much from a user welfare point of view. It's done more to use the users to understand what can drive more engagement, or essentially look at the objectives that the companies want to follow. Yeah. Another is that in many other cases, you might involve many users, but not embrace conflict so much, right? Over there, you're looking more in terms of being politically, right, agreeable to as many people as you can. And conflict is thrown out of the window. But even though many of the theories that we've seen, they claim that you can't throw conflict away. You need to embrace conflict, right? So politics is therefore reduced, and therefore they say that, well, you need to focus a lot more on capacity building, so that in this participatory design, right, you're also continuously building the capacity of the users to be able to participate in a better way, so that at least it's not user capacity which hampers their participation. Yeah, have an agenda that is social as well as political. Yeah, so embrace, right, what understand what which groups are disadvantaged, which groups have historically been discriminated against, and let's take that as a starting point and design from that point onwards. Yeah, work as researchers to produce new learning, but also as activists to support partners in their vision, partners meaning various stakeholders and users, right? Build organizational frameworks also that allow this, right? So like co-determination, where users have a say in what technologies are being built. Yeah, rather than, right. So users, right. So we've seen the example of Reddit, right? So now technically, legally, the users of Reddit don't have any say on the company. Yeah. But actually, in principle, they were able to impose. And in fact, eventually, the CEO of such a big company actually was forced to resign because of all the backlash. Right. So that's one way in which there's a lot of influence that users were able to exercise, but potentially that is incorporated in the law itself, right? That users or even workers can have representatives on the board of the company. Yeah, then that can be one way to, right, or they can be shareholders in the company. Right? Then that can be one way to impose some of these rules or some of these principles into the functioning of the organization itself. Yeah, go beyond building prototypes to eventually building products, right? So this is something which is a big issue for the research community. So from the research community does a lot, right? So they try to work using participatory design methods and build prototypes and everything, and they try it out and they show that it works, but very often it's just restricted to prototypes, right, and that's one of the drawbacks. So in fact, this is true for all of our work also, that we need to actually aim for higher, right, that not just to write papers or to build prototypes, right, but to actually also work towards scaling these up, making sure that they're actually adopted and used, because otherwise what's the point, right? Otherwise, if you've just done and proposed some ideas and maybe done some small validation, unless it's not adopted at scale, it's not really impactful. Yeah. So there's a strong undercurrent now that is coming up, which is saying that, well, you need to be more participatory and, right, follow these principles in the design process, but also, right, you need to scale and bring impact, right? So this is sort of taking academia into more of a activist position. And many people actually argue that that's actually also the need of the hour, right? So if you look at some of the key global issues that are facing us, right? Global warming, inequality, discrimination. Now, these are serious issues. And thankfully, the world today is more aware of these issues and wants to, right? Many people want to work towards that. And what we talk about in the coming classes, right, that the political economy often prevents us from doing so. But right, so the problem, the target of this problem, therefore, is coming down ultimately. Not so much that there's so much of a need to solve research problems and stuff, right? That is happening. All that is happening very well. A lot of solutions are already known. The problem is actually in scaling these up, and therefore that political economy, fixing that political economy, should also be a crucial goal that we need to follow. And we can only do that, therefore, by looking at ourselves not just as academics or researchers, but also as citizens who want to work and scale some of these things for a better world, right? So many people actually argue that that's also the need of the hour, that we really need to not just be academics, but be academics as well as activists to scale all of this up. So now more on participatory design, right? That basically it has this three characteristics, right, which we've talked about. That it needs cooperative work between designers and users. It needs a critical stance of siding with the weaker side, and you also need to think about long-term sustainability of these solutions. Right? So there's a deep commitment to democracy, deep commitment to conflict, and a deep commitment to actually working with the users and continuously moving towards, right, a better and better world. Yeah. So right, but at the same time, right, now some of the challenges also in this space, right, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the political economy, right, that trade unions are weakening. So if right, so participatory design, remember, was born out of the labor movement in Scandinavian countries. But at the same time, we see labor unions as weakening, even, right, global, the political economy, right, which where many of the big tech companies are very powerful, even more so than they can also resist attempts by the state to bring them under control, right? So that's the context in which we need to. So the job is even harder, right? Because in this context, current context of the world, it's even harder to follow many of these principles. Yeah. So these things, I mean, it's very interesting how all these points are coming together, and I've mostly what I've tried to do is to situate all of it in right, how we can think about, right, what can be more interesting and relevant ways to move forward. So, like, similarly, now when you think about participatory design, now we've also discussed importance of deployment management, right? That it's not just that you want to design stuff, but this design will need continuous management as well, and but management towards what objectives, right? So this is again where, right, the development sector meaning the social development sector, right, that has built many such methods, many such frameworks, right, where you think about in a particular project, what are the inputs you're giving, what are the outputs you're getting, eventually what outcomes and impact is it leading to, right? So it's basically going from left to right over here, that using certain inputs, you follow some mechanisms, and these mechanisms lead to, let's say, better knowledge, right? So these are called outputs, which are basically intermediate products. These outputs will eventually lead to outcomes where you're building, right, more engagement, more skills, better competence, and eventually lead to sustained impact, where you've built certain networks of relationships between designers and users. You're also able to influence wider stakeholders. So, right, so essentially, you can now also view participatory design, and you can, right, so this particular paper says how can I measure, how can I keep track that is my participatory design method working well or not, right? So they say that, well, there are already these frameworks that exist. It's also something called the theory of change framework. Theory of change meaning that what's the initial theory that we're starting with to bring this particular change. So this is essentially outlining that theory. And then you can see if your work is in line with the theory or where is it deviating and what corrective measures can you take. Yeah, so that so the theory is really laying out that if you take certain inputs and you work with certain processes, and it will lead to some outputs, outcomes, and impact. And then you can start monitoring whether you're able to do that well or not. Yeah. So there's a lot, therefore, in this space of participatory design, right? A lot of theorizing that has been done, a lot of experience of deploying these methods to build technologies, right? But the struggle now is how many of these can be scaled up, yeah, and adopted. And at that point, it becomes more of a political struggle rather than any technical, right, research or problem that you need to solve. It's more of a political struggle of adopting these methods at scale. Yeah. Right. So now similarly, right, even right around the same time when participatory design and all these methods were being developed, another method was called the ethics method that came up by Enid Mumford. And right, so you can see, right, that these are all very old methods, right? So it's really telling you that none of these problems are new as such, right? People have been struggling with impact of technology and everything for a long time, and they've done, right, a lot of theorizing of how it should be, how it can be worked out, right? So I won't go into the detail, right? You can read through, right? But it's basically like a sequence diagram of, right, how to do participatory design, how to be ethical in your work, and it's all about, right. So they also talk about many other, right, issues that can happen, that when you're trying to create participation, sometimes the communication can be hampered. Sometimes you may not be able to get inputs from people easily. There are differences, right? Fundamental even perceptions, right? That let's say you walk into a lot of the work that we do at Gramani, for example, right? You walk into let's say a self-help group of women, but who are from a higher caste community, and you walk into and then you interact with a self-help group where you have lower caste communities as community members, right? There's a big difference in the interaction. On right, one group already is very empowered and they are able to talk to you as equals. In another group, it's not that simple, right? You need to spend more time, you need to gain more trust before you can actually uncover what underlying issues there might be. Yeah. So all of these things are also what people have noticed for a long time, that to create participation, you need ultimately this participation will work once people are able to communicate effectively with each other. But that may not happen all the time properly. So right, so you need to be more delicate in your approach. You need to be more empathetic, and you need to give more time to really understand and to be able to listen to the people. Yeah. So right, but the idea is that there are many of such of these methods, right, which right. So we talked about the neo-humanist paradigm, right, which sort of embrace that there is a lot of subjectivity and it may not be very easy to understand, right? You really need to spend time with the community to understand that, and then to manage these conflicts that can arise with technology once technology is introduced. Yeah, right. So similarly, right, these other papers also talk about complexities in participation, that right, you really need to think, right, also what methods of participation are you building, right? Are you saying that, are you interacting, have you built structures that you can interact with everybody, or are you, right, which is sort of more like a town hall meeting, right? Or are you working with representatives, which is the communitization or asset-based approach, that you've identified some key people from the community who you think are good representatives, and then you're working with them, right? So now you can clearly think about, right, pros and cons of all of this, right? Or is it self-selecting, that those who are participating are naturally right, self-selecting themselves because they understand and they want to do something for you, but there might be a large chunk of people who for various other reasons, right, maybe they've rejected, or they don't have the time to participate, they're very busy with their day-to-day work, earning their daily bread, so they don't have time to really engage in all of this discussion, brainstorming, right? So many of these therefore things also come into the picture, that participation itself has many different points of view with how you can create participation, right? So that is also something that becomes a factor in how effective your participatory design method is going to be. Yeah. Similarly, right? How do these discussions pan out? Is there active debate, or is it like more very passive debate? Are people not actively participating, and so on, right? Right. So another very good paper is Tyranny of Participation, which again, right, talks about, right, participation can fail if it ignores the local context. If for example, the participation process is led by bureaucrats and who are not really skilled at facilitating engagement, right? And therefore, I mean, these are skills. You need to really either acquire those skills, or find people who have them, who can involve people, right? And make sure that their perspectives are brought out, right? Or we were talking about it. Sometimes people may not be able to invest time because they're just too busy. So their perspectives will get missed. So how do you make sure that that's not happening, right? Or at least you're aware that, okay, I've missed out some perspective, and then you can separately try to regain some of those views. Yeah. Similarly, right, are you really trying to run away from conflict, or are you embracing conflict? Yeah, just because it might be easier to kind of ignore the messiness that might be. Yeah. So these are all issues that do arise in practice, right? So many, right? So several people have talked about all of these factors, and right, so I'm sure you get the broad idea. Yeah, that importance of participation, of course, but also that it is challenging to do that in practice. And a challenge at a different level is that even if you're able to do all that, how do you make sure that these same processes are followed and adopted at scale? And at that point, it's more of a political struggle. Yeah. So let me pause here. Right. So now another, yeah, go on.
When you say that we need the challenge to scale, these are like political. So will the researchers won't be able to involve them into this process, because from what I perceive in our society is that politicians and academia do not go side by side. So how to ensure that the research output is really being used in the political agenda and shaping our policies.
Yeah, no, great. And so the point is that we need to do that ourselves. Yeah. I think that's what the current view is turning out to be, right? That academics shouldn't think of themselves that they can just sit in their, right, what are called ivory towers, and do their research and then hope that that research will get used in the right way. Yeah. So it goes back to, right. So a lot of what we've talked about, right. Very early on, we talked about Norbert Wiener, who's basically considered as the father of computer ethics. And he had worked on, right, during the World War, he'd worked on missile control systems. But later on, once, right, so he wrote an open letter that some military equipment manufacturer then contacted him to ask for some papers, or something, right? Some research that Norbert Wiener had done. And Norbert Wiener basically, so he wrote an open letter rejecting that request and said that I don't trust your judgment to use this research in an ethical manner. Right. So the World War was basically, it was a turning point in how people were really thinking about technology and ethics. Yeah. Because, right, on the one hand, right, so the atom bomb was built. And right, so it was, I mean, scientifically, it was like a breakthrough that such things could be done. Right, there are also many, right, so-called quote unquote social good reasons for that, right? Nuclear power, for example, right? Right, but at the same time, people then saw, right, the horror with when the nuclear bomb was actually used, right? So that was really a turning point, right? That technology, right, has this dual use nature, and you need a lot of thought, you need a lot of regulation in how the technology gets used, right? And then the argument is not just about technology but also about research. Yeah, that the research that you've done, right, you've written a paper right now, how do you make sure that that research gets used in the right way and not for some social harm, right? Weiner basically, right, back then itself, he said that it's going to be very challenging and we can't run away from it. Academics, researchers can't run away from embracing a particular politics. Yeah. And that's pretty much right the argument that we've seen being echoed throughout, right? So when we were talking about user interfaces, for example, and persuasive interfaces, now the behavioral economics has built many of these effects like decoy effect and so on. But the point is that that research, that science can be used for the good as well as for the bad. Yeah. Like in user interfaces, we saw examples of dark patterns and all of that, right? And we've been seeing same things, same points occurring again and again, right? In algorithms, right? What's the objective with which these things are done? What objectives are coded in the algorithms? So there's no running away from politics. Yeah. So that's the point, right? That on the one level, whatever research we do, we need to, the politics are embedded in our thought process. We may not realize it, but it's there. Yeah. In terms of, right, what things are we researching, who's funding us to do that research, right? So all of these will give you hints as to what politics is driving our research, right? Then the argument, however, goes even further that the politics will not be restricted just to writing research papers. But if you really want to make sure that it gets used in the right way, you've got to go the extra mile yourself. Yeah. So that's the point, right? That where many people now are saying that academics actually need to also become activists so that they can make sure that the right research is being supported, which is going to make the world a better place and tackle some of these big problems that we see around us of inequality, of global warming, and so on. And right, so that we're able to work on the right thing. And also, we need to make sure that the wider we're able to influence the wider political economy so that these things get adopted at scale. Yeah, right. So that's the point, right? That we can't run away from it, right? If somebody says that, well, my job is just to do research, write papers, that person is really fooling himself or herself. Yeah, that's the bottom line over here.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, in the process of building technology, at what stage these methods, these design methods and paradigm could be used? Like, is it planning or requirement gathering or design, implementation or maintenance phase in the software development lifecycle? Where do they come into play?
Yeah. No, so we're just getting to that. So one of my perspectives on all of this is that even though, for example, participatory design talks a lot about long-term sustainability, for example, yeah, but very often even participatory design and definitely most of the other design methods that we've seen, all of them are restricted largely at the design stage, which means that it's all being done with an idea that once you have designed something, keeping all of these different things in mind, taking different perspectives into account, ethics into account, and so on, the rest of it will work out properly. Yeah, right. But one of the things that we saw is that there is need for continuous management as well, right? So the design processes in themselves are not adequate, are not sufficient by themselves. They're good to start things off, but they need continuous steering. So there'll be continuously new things that you will find out, new problems that you will encounter, and you will have to redesign. So there's a loop over here. Yeah. So most of the methods, even though they say that many methods claim that, well, they aim for long-term sustainability and everything. In practice, actually, once you see where projects where these methods were applied, you will find that in most cases it was just at an initial design stage. Partly, and that is partly because many of these things are being done by researchers. Yeah. So researchers, right, they design it and they build prototypes, but that's it. That's only as far as they can go. Very few of them actually, hardly any, go into a stage of actually trying to scale it up. Right. So Gramvani, for example, my own work, I say, is sort of an exception over here. Right, because we work with not just designing, but then we've encountered so many other challenges once we had to deploy this and to scale it up. There were many of these new challenges that came up, right? So that's where we talk about continuous management itself as being very important. Yeah. So we'll just get to some of this, that whatever we've talked about in terms of participatory design, a lot of it in practice has been restricted to just at the design stage. Yeah. But something called action research, which we'll just get to in a couple of slides, right? That takes a more, it includes both design as well as management, so to say. Yeah. So action research, this perspective is really about trying to take a much broader view that this design has to continuously evolve, and it needs that the same principles of community participation, everything, but on a more long-term basis. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now, right, same. So far, right, the participatory design and everything we're talking about, it might give a impression that you're talking about, right, what should the technology look like and so on, right? But the same principles also apply even in machine learning or algorithms. So here another very exciting research area that is that how do you actually involve the community in participatory design of the algorithms itself? Yeah. Now this is challenging, as you can imagine, right? Because how much do communities really understand algorithms or machine learning, or like, we've talked about all these different fairness objectives. But do you think you can go and ask people whether, right, would you like a system that does error parity versus counterfactual fairness versus demographic parity? You think people will be able to understand? Well, not really. Yeah. So people are basically trying, right? How can that be done? Right? That we might acknowledge that, okay, we do need to encode certain different fairness principles, and each fairness principle we've also seen is relevant for different stakeholders. Right. So we saw this example in Arvind Narayanan's talk, right? 21 definitions of fairness, of how one kind of a definition of fairness makes sense from a judge's point of view, policymakers' point of view. Another one makes sense from a society's point of view. Another one makes sense from the defendant's point of view, right? And all of these are also incompatible with each other. You can't satisfy all of them at the same time. There are impossibility results that say that. So how do you find the balance, right? How do you discover, right? If you want to be participatory, right? How do you discover what is it that the community wants? And also, how do you make the community learn? Because they may not know everything from the start, but through this process of discussion and debate, they can build up their own views, right? Which is the learning element of inner democracy, right? Right now, doing this for algorithms is very difficult, and this is another very, very exciting area of, right? So it touches upon many things. It touches upon things like data literacy, that how can people start understanding data in a better way, right? Because normally, right, hardly any people, right, I mean, by and large, if you look at the community, they'll find problems in reading graphs, or like, so how do you visualize this data, for example, for them to understand it easily? It goes into things like computational thinking, that how can they think in a more process oriented procedural manner, right? It goes into understanding, right, objective functions and so on. So one way that people have tried is basically elicit pairwise recommendations, right? So essentially, like, think of it like case studies, that you present one particular, right, present a case that in this, right, but the problem that they were trying to solve was that restaurants have a lot of surplus food left over after the day, right? And there are organizations which basically work in collecting this surplus from restaurants and distributing it to food shelters or food banks, so that the surplus food can be given to poor people, right? Now over here there are many objectives that you would want to optimize, right? So for a restaurant, you might want to give its food to neighboring more food banks in that neighborhood, right? So that fuel expenses and transportation is low, you can quickly get to it. But you would also want to impose some fairness constraints. That is possible. Some communities might be very far away from restaurants, and you don't want to leave them out. Yeah, you want some surplus food to also go over there, right? So you can, right, if you model it computationally, you'll think about different issues that will arise over here. Yeah. So now the question is then, how do you figure out what's the right fairness objective and so on? So one method is to give pairwise recommendations, right? That given a particular scenario, you then ask people, right, what would you like to be done? And once you get a lot of these pairwise recommendations, then you can see which particular model do they coincide with, right? which particular objective function or fairness constraint do these pairwise recommendations of people agree with the most. Yeah. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to use these recommendations itself to build a new model. Yeah, right. So use these as basically training data and to come up with a model to do that. Yeah. So again, so there's very interesting work that's happening in this space of how to elicit people's preferences to guide algorithm design itself. Yeah, and it touches upon, right, like we said, one is preference elicitation, how to do that, how to build models based on that. And then it also at a different level, it also touches it up with computational thinking, how to get people to think more in this more procedural computational style. And similarly on data literacy and different, right, all of these areas. So lots of interesting stuff over here. Yeah. So again, we keep coming back to Marx, right? With this whole idea, right? You can say that, well, another even more ambitious view that you can keep is that, well, I don't want to just design stuff, right? And think about it, how people are able to participate and everything, but I want to leave behind some capabilities, right? Or what are called infrastructures. I want to leave behind some infrastructure so that people are able to continuously now, right, follow these principles, right? So I might have worked with them to design a particular technology, right? But how can some of these skills be left behind in the community so that in the future they can apply them to any other technology in the process? Yeah. So this is actually again very closely related to another concept of Marx, where right, he said that, right, what is the role of discussing with people, discussing with workers, right? Even if you want to survey workers, what is the fundamental role of this? So he said that the role is not just data collection to understand what problems people are facing or what are their views, but through this act of answering questions, they will begin to learn a lot themselves, right? Because through this act of answering questions, they will be forced to think, and they will be forced to contrast their situation with that of others, right? So Marx wrote this, right? This is not very well known, right? So he basically built this list of 101 questions, right? So if you go through this, and what is most remarkable is that all of these questions are very relevant even today, right? So he of course did this in the late 19th century, but right, where industrialization was using child labor, and workers were living in very poor conditions. There were poor wages given to them, right? And this is actually absolutely relevant even in India as of now, and in many other countries of the global south. Because what's actually happened, right, that through this process of globalization, the very poor industrial conditions that were there in the West have essentially been exported to global south countries, right? So here people are working at low wages, producing goods and so on, right? And you hear this a lot in garment manufacturing, for example, right? That the cost of a t-shirt that you pay, right? You might buy a $20 t-shirt, right? Or a 1,000 rupee t-shirt. How much of the money is actually going to the workers? It's like a couple of cents, right? Like 50 rupees or something of that order. That's actually what is ultimately going in terms of wages given for the person who actually made the t-shirt, right? All the rest of it is actually transportation cost, profit margins of the brand, profit margins of the local manufacturer. And right, so Marx actually had this list of, right, is the shop overcrowded with machinery? So just go through it, right? It's a brilliant list. Each and every question you will be able to relate to news that you read in the newspaper day in, day out, right? About accidents happening to people, about fire breaking out in factories and people dying in these fires, poor conditions, low wages, moving to piece rate instead of wages, right? Piece rate is where you're paying people based on the number of products that they've produced instead of paying them a wage per hour, or wage based on the time that they've spent, right? But the point is that what Marx said, that the reason for this survey is not to collect information, right? You receive additions to your wages for overtime and this and that, right? So it's not that we want to document. We already know the conditions. The conditions are horrible. It's not, the role is not to just gather data to document, but the role of this survey is that through this act of answering questions, right, people will gain the perspective, that these questions, why am I being asked these questions? Right? It means that these things are important. It means that many other people might be facing similar problems that I am facing. Right? And this method is called workers' inquiry. Yeah. So the idea is that with participatory design, similarly, we can think of it with a similar perspective, like how Marx was thinking from a workers' inquiry point of view. That what you want to also aim for is that through involving people in this participatory design of technology and everything, ultimately you're equipping them so that they can cope with any other technology also in the future. Yeah. And those skills and learning is being built so that they can do all this in a much better way. Yeah. So again, right, very interesting perspectives of, right, the wider scope of participatory design. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, we were talking about action research, right? So now, unfortunately, in practice, while, right, so much of theorizing has happened, so much of prototyping has happened through participatory design, a lot of it has been done by researchers, right? And therefore, it's not really panned out into any long-term kind of projects, right? But however, even among in the research community, another paradigm is called action research. Yeah, that you actually are a part of the community. You basically become a part of that community and you're working with them continuously, right? So we just come back, right? So essentially it's like this, what they call this continuous spiral of, right, you work with the community to plan something, then you act upon it, then you see, right, what happened, and then you plan more, you act more, and you reflect, and you keep following the spiral, right? So that you're continuously working and innovating with the community, right, solving problems as you go along and making the technologies work in a better and better way in terms of what the communities want, and also so that is ultimately leading to empowerment, leading to more equality. Yeah, as opposed to thinking more from like a one shot, right? You design something and you deploy it and that's it, right? Here you're actually continuously engaged, right? So again, now you can think about it, right? That how much do companies actually do that, right? Nobody does that actually. In fact, even academics are not able to follow, right? Even in prototypes, they're not able to follow this because it means the projects are much longer. You need funding for these projects, right? And it's not straightforward to achieve any of this. Yeah. But yeah, the point is that again, right, such methods exist. People have been working and thinking about these methods for a long time, right? Learn by being a part of the action, as research leading to social action, right? Focuses on highly contextualized, localized solutions, and with an emphasis on transferability than generalizability. Right? So the reason why it's called action research, right? So the research part is also important over here, that ultimately through this process, right, you might be doing this in one community, but then you also want to document, and right, so that similar methods, similar processes can also be adapted in other communities that somebody else might want to also do. Yeah. So it also, right, links with concepts like wicked problems or postmodernist kind of approaches that we've been talking about, right? That you won't really know in one shot, right? What's the right thing to do, right? Because that rationalist approach is very myopic. Rather, the world is complex and you need to evolve, right? New problems will arise that you've not foreseen, and you need to continuously keep reworking. Or like what the Rittel and Weber paper said, that it's not about solving, it's about resolving it again and again. Yeah. This action research sort of embraces that view. Yeah. And similarly, from a research point of view, they say that, well, whatever you're inferring, right? How do we judge whether, as a researcher, a good job has been done, right? So the idea is that the inferences, right? You should be able to confirm the results, right? Whatever is being reported, right? It should be documented in a way that somebody else can also confirm, right? The data is dependable, the results are transferable, right? Not exactly replicable because every context is different, but at least some broad insights may have emerged which might apply across contexts as well, right? And that all of this is credible. Yeah. So again, right? So they say that, well, researchers should not try to think about building a model, because then that model becomes the key thing that you're trying to test, right? But rather these models will be changing, ever changing, and different. So that's the idea, right? That again, right, to involve yourself in the community so that you're continuously innovating with them, solving and discovering new challenges and solving them as you go along. Yeah. So I hope you've gotten that this broad view of right relevance of participation, relevance of being in the community, right? And you can then now easily contrast, right? That many of you would step into jobs at some point and work, right? And many of you would actually be working in companies which are building products for end users, right? So at that point, right, this is something that you should reflect upon, that how much of that work is actually right done or formulated with some of these principles. How much of it is right the company founders or the designers imposing their own view, right, without actually understanding right what is the view of the community or what challenges are coming up. Yeah, because many of these things actually methods do exist, right? It's a conscious choice that these methods are not followed, right? And that's why it's called a political struggle. These methods are not followed because well you're working in a political environment which is forcing right quick development, growth, scaling, a number of users, right, all of that regular right speech that you see. Then this is just to right like a tip of the iceberg. We'll get into this in more detail when we talk about the political economy. Yeah. So this paper also very interestingly, so it says that well, why are some design methods publicized more than others, right? Why, for example, is the functionalist paradigm of design so popular, right? Functionalist meaning well, everything is known, this technology will definitely lead to this output, right? Why is that view so popular, right? And how is that view actually pushed? Right, so they talk about how startup toolkits, startup weekends, hackathons, pitch contests, incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces, right? All of these are venues, all of these are pathways which actually perpetuate a very functionalist Silicon Valley kind of a view of scaling. And governments, corporations, entrepreneurs, many people are all just a part of this charade, so to say. Because right, so they talk about several examples, right? Like in Ghana, right? So basically they did an ethnographic study of talking to entrepreneurs in different countries and how these entrepreneurs were trying to align themselves with right. So like a company saying that we'll give right, we're running this hackathon and we'll give some money to the winners in this hackathon to implement their project. Yep. Right, or right, like we'll do a startup competition and business plan competition and then we'll give money to people to do that, right? So right, but when they actually talk to entrepreneurs who had participated, even won some of these competitions, right, it became clear that well the entrepreneurs acknowledge the problem, right, that executing business in Ghana is a different ball game altogether. It's not as clean as, it's nowhere as clean as what is projected by companies who are running these hackathons and sponsoring them, right? Because they're being run with this predominant view that this technology this problem, first of all, the hackathon problem itself is framed well, and that solving this will really will make a big difference. But this ignores the reality that the infrastructure, right, power, electricity, internet access, all of that is broken. It's very difficult to find talent, right? Good local talent to work in this space. The rest of the ecosystem, if you've been keeping up with the news, right, you would have seen this whole scandal at the World Bank on the ease of business rankings. So India has also been a party to right all of this, right? We're touting right that ease of doing business in India, right? We've run up the rankings and so on. But now that ranking method is being questioned, right? Because that ranking method was actually using indicators which are partly meaningless also, and many important indicators are actually ignored, like quality of the infrastructure, quality of electricity, right? All you need all of that to run a business properly. And similarly, some other indicators were emphasized a lot more, that ease of labor layoff, level of government involvement, if it is less than the better, right? So the point is that the entrepreneurs know it, and essentially what they're doing is fake it till you make it. Yeah. So they're participating in these hackathons and everything. They're not because they they agree with the view, but just because, well, it's the only, right, you do need money in some way or the other, right? So you play the game. Yeah. Similarly, right, they right now the same things, right, are being done in so many of these countries, right? So look at Jamaica, right? Here they said that hackathons, right, is a route for the Silicon Valley companies to expand locally, to find partners so that it can further their business. So you see companies like WhatsApp and everybody doing, right, Facebook doing this a lot, where they try to find local companies, but who have to use Facebook tools, who have to use WhatsApp APIs and so on to do the work, right? So ultimately, they're not so much supporting the growth of local technologies, which might be more appropriate, more indigenously designed technologies that might be more relevant contextually for the people. They're not doing that, but in the name, right? But with the same goal, right? With the same stated goal that it will help the community, it'll change these markets. They're actually just pushing their own stuff. Yeah. Right? So the main desire is to implement a technology, to push their own technology, than to actually solve an actual real problem. Yeah. Then another example they give is that of China, where, right, a lot of these incubators were set up. It was done with usual, right, eviction of rural populations for land acquisition, where these incubators were set up and everything, right? But now many of them have just turned out into real estate operations. So it's not that they're encouraging these incubators are really encouraging companies to find solutions to important problems that are needed, but it's just become rental spaces, right, for cheap rent for companies to do just the usual stuff that's happening. Yeah. So this is sort of just a like a right at tip of the iceberg, so to say, of how the political economy, the broader political economy, is what's responsible for promoting, pushing certain design methods, certain views, but and sort of responsible for ignoring, right, many of the other more equitable, more ethically grounded design principles that we've been talking about. Yeah. So that's the point. Yeah. So you get the broad picture, right? Of right, that I mean, after all this, right, realization of relevance, places where ethics is needed, methods through which ethics can be incorporated, principles of equality can be incorporated, right? So a lot is known. There's challenges, right? Participation itself, right, is not easy. Like we've seen, management of technologies, continuous steering is not easy, right? As we've seen, right? But and all that complexity has to be embraced, right? Only then can you do something about it, right? But on the other hand, what you also see is very naive views, and which are actually misleading views as well, right? That there is, right, which basically says there's no complexity. It's straightforward, right? Use Aadhaar for direct benefit transfers, and that's all that you need to solve problems of corruption and to provide, right, make sure that people get what they deserve, right? It's total crap, honestly. So, but that's the world we're living in. Yeah. So that is why now, soon enough, now in the next couple of classes, we'll get into some of these complexities, right? We'll first start with seeing complexities within organizations. That in organizations itself, well, some people might want to follow these principles, methods, and so on, but what challenges do they face? And then the broader political economy of technology, and how that sort of forces conscious sidelining of many of these principles that we know are important, and they hamper the acknowledgement of complexity. And that is why many people, right, like I've been saying, right, there's now a strong undercurrent in the academic community to sort of just step out of our ivory towers and to